They say that when winter comes to Ontario, it doesn't just fall from the sky. It creeps into your bones, settling in the places where youth used to reside. For 62 years, my hands had been my life. They were rough, calloused, scarred by the sharp bite of chisels and the rough caress of raw mahogany, cherry, and walnut. I had spent my life as a woodcraft artisan, breathing in the sweet earthy scent of cedar and oil, shaping beauty out of the silent trunks of fallen trees. I learned the trade from my grandfather, who always told me that every piece of timber has a soul sleeping inside it, and it is the artisan's duty to wake it up with patience and respect. Over the decades, I had built a reputation for perfection, working in my small cabin workshop on the outskirts of Toronto, surrounded by towering pines that stood like ancient guardians against the harsh northern winters. But that winter, a different kind of cold had taken root inside my body. A persistent dry cough had started in the late autumn, a rattling sound that echoed in the quiet corners of my workshop, shaking my frame every time I tried to lift a heavy slab of timber. At first, I dismissed it as the usual occupational hazard of a lifetime spent inhaling fine sawdust, but by the time the first heavy lake-effect blizzard blanketed my cabin, the pain in my chest had become a constant, sharp needle, reminding me of my own mortality with every labored breath I took. To understand the depth of my craft, one must understand the nature of the wood itself. Mahogany is stubborn, dense, resisting the blade until you find its grain, while cherry is soft, yielding, smelling of sweet fruit when the saw teeth bite into it. Walnut is dark and solemn, like the deep earth from which it came, holding secrets in its tight, complex whorls. I spent decades in that silent dance, my fingers learning the micro-textures of each board, knowing exactly when to apply pressure and when to let the tool glide. This was not merely work. It was a form of meditation, a way to connect with the slow, ancient rhythms of nature that modern men had long forgotten in their haste to build towering cities of concrete and cold steel. The timber industry had changed, of course, moving toward cheap pressboard and computerized assembly lines, but I had clung to the old ways. People from the city would drive up to my workshop just to run their fingers over the seamless joinery of my cabinets, wondering how a simple man in flannel could create something that felt so alive. They did not understand that wood remembers. It remembers the rain, the sun, the storms it weathered while it was still a tree, and if you listen closely, it will tell you how it wants to be shaped. But as my coughs worsened, my ability to listen began to fade. The physical exhaustion was a heavy cloak I could not shake off. The cold air of the workshop, once my favorite companion, now felt like a blade in my lungs. I began spending more hours sitting by the fireplace, staring at the embers, feeling a strange, hollow dread that I had never known in all my years of solitary labor. I was alone, and for the first time, the solitude felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. Pierce's childhood had been filled with these smells and textures, but he had always looked past them. While Maeve would play with the curls of cedar shavings, pretending they were golden crowns, Pierce would stand by the window, watching the luxury cars drive down the highway toward the city. He would ask me how much each piece of furniture sold for, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the profit margins. I tried to teach him that the true profit was in the creation, in the satisfaction of running your hand over a finished surface and finding no flaws. But his mind was already tuned to a different frequency. He wanted shortcuts. He wanted to leap from raw lumber to gold without the messy, painful process of seasoning and carving. I saw it then, but I hoped that time and maturity would soften his hard edges. The medical diagnosis came on a gray Tuesday afternoon that seemed to drain all color from the world. Dr. Henderson's office was small and cramped, smelling of antiseptic, old leather-bound books, and stale paper. He had been my physician for 20 years, and he didn't look at me when he spoke. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed firmly on the manila folder in his hands, tracing the lines of the medical report with a heavy pen. It was early-stage lung cancer. He assured me it was highly treatable, that a swift lobectomy could remove the localized tumor before it had any chance to spread to my lymph nodes. But there was a financial catch that made my heart freeze faster than any winter storm. The healthcare system, even with my basic provincial insurance, required a co-payment of exactly $3,500 to clear the pre-admission hurdles and secure a spot on the operating table within the next 2 weeks. To a wealthy man, $3,500 is a rounding error, a mere bar tab at a high-end restaurant, or the cost of a single night in a luxury hotel in New York. To a retired woodworker living on a modest pension, whose savings had been slowly hollowed out by the rising costs of heating oil, groceries, and property taxes, it was an insurmountable, terrifying wall. I sat at my worn oak kitchen table that evening, watching the snow lash violently against the double-paned window. The wind howled through the pines, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to mock my fragility. My mind turned to my eldest son, Pierce. 32 years old, Pierce was a man of the modern, digital world. He had left Toronto a decade ago, chasing the glittering, aggressive promise of Manhattan's financial district. Now he was a highly successful hedge fund manager, living in a world of glass towers, sharp lines, and high-stakes financial maneuvers. He drove a pristine midnight blue Porsche, wore bespoke Tom Ford suits, and spoke in the clipped, efficient language of a man who believed that everything in this life could be quantified on a ledger. I had not asked Pierce for a single dime since he left. I had watched his meteoric rise from a distance, proud of his professional success, but increasingly troubled by the coldness and arrogance that seemed to have settled over his soul like a layer of thick ice. I remembered when he was a boy, how he would sit on a stool in my workshop, his small fingers tracing the wood shavings. I had hoped he would inherit my love for the craft. But as he grew, his eyes began to reflect the cold light of computer screens and stock tickers. He didn't want to build things. He wanted to own things. He didn't want to shape raw materials. He wanted to manipulate abstract numbers. With trembling fingers, I dialed his private number. The line rang 3 times, a sterile digital tone, before it was finally answered. I could hear the muted, roaring hum of New York traffic in the background, punctuated by the smooth, quiet purr of a high-end twin-turbocharged engine. "Bixby, I'm in the middle of navigating some incredibly tight Lincoln Tunnel traffic." Pierce's voice came through the speaker, crisp, loud, and entirely devoid of any personal warmth. "What is it, Dad? I don't have a lot of time to chat today. I have a major client dinner in an hour." I took a deep breath, trying to steady the rattle in my chest and the nervousness in my hands. I told him about the diagnosis. I spoke slowly, choosing my words carefully, not wanting to sound desperate, keeping my voice as calm as the seasoned wood I carved. I explained the surgery, the doctor's urgency, and the $3,500 copay that stood between me and a clean bill of health. I told him I needed to borrow the money, and that I would find a way to pay him back, even if it took selling off my oldest, most cherished carving tools that had belonged to my grandfather. I tried to convey the gravity of the situation without begging, hoping that some residual spark of filial affection would compel him to offer help. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. For a brief, foolish second, I allowed myself to hope that the bond of shared blood would transcend the physical and emotional distance between us. But when Pierce spoke again, his voice was colder than the gales howling outside. "Honestly, Dad, I'm deeply disappointed," Pierce said, and I could hear the faint, luxurious sigh of Italian leather as he adjusted himself in his driver's seat. "We've talked about this before. Financial responsibility isn't just an abstract concept for the wealthy. It's a fundamental rule of survival. You've spent your entire life living hand to mouth, clinging to an obsolete manual trade, and now you're treating me like a personal ATM because you failed to plan for basic life emergencies. It's a very bad habit, and frankly, it's embarrassing." "Pierce, I am not asking for a handout," I whispered, my voice cracking slightly as the pain in my chest flared. "I am asking for my life. The doctor says if we don't operate in the next 14 days, the tumor could become inoperable. I just need a short-term loan. I will sign any agreement you want." "Every bad investment has an excuse, Dad," Pierce replied, his tone shifting into the patronizing, lecture-like delivery he usually reserved for underperforming junior analysts at his firm. From a strictly financial perspective, throwing $3,500 into a high-risk medical procedure for a 62-year-old with no assets and no earning potential is a terrible allocation of capital. It's what we call a bad liability. I have fiduciary duties to my investors, Dad. I'm currently putting together a $50 million real estate investment trust. My personal liquidity is completely locked up in escrow, and honestly, rewarding poor financial planning only encourages more poor planning. You need to look into public assistance, government grants, or find a local charity. I can't keep sentimental bailouts on my balance sheet. It's just not how the real world works. You have to face the consequences of your choices. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest, leaving me hollowed out, breathless, and incredibly cold. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the park, the child whose scraped knees I had bandaged with gentle care, the young man whose entire college tuition had been paid for by the sweat of my brow and the deep, painful blisters on my palms. He had forgotten the hands that built his foundation. He had reduced my survival to a capital allocation decision, a simple cost-benefit analysis where his own father didn't generate enough return to justify the expense. I see, I managed to say, my voice barely louder than the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. I won't trouble you again, Pierce. Good. I'm glad we have a rational understanding, he said, his tone instantly shifting back to the brisk, polite efficiency of a busy corporate executive. I have to go. My GPS is rerouting me to the West Side Highway. Take care of yourself. Dad, the call disconnected with a sharp digital beep that sounded like a flatline. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen for a very long time, the cold phone still pressed to my ear. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the realization that to my own flesh and blood, my existence was nothing more than an unfavorable financial equation, a bad line item to be deleted. I put the phone down on the table, my hands shaking violently, and stared out at the relentless falling snow. The world felt incredibly vast, incredibly cold, and entirely indifferent to whether I lived or died. The contrast between my two children had always been a source of quiet wonder and deep heartbreak to me. While Pierce had been born with his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, seeking avenues of escape, wealth, and status, my youngest daughter, Maeve, had always been grounded in the quiet, messy, and beautiful reality of the present. At 24, Maeve was a student nurse, working grueling 70-hour weeks at an understaffed, underfunded county hospital while trying to keep up with her demanding, exhausting coursework. She lived in a cramped, drafty apartment in a rundown part of Toronto, her life a constant, stressful cycle of double shifts, stale coffee, and the perpetual suffocating worry of rent payments. Her uniform was a set of faded blue scrubs, washed so many times that the fabric had become thin, frayed, and soft. A quiet testament to her dedication to a profession that gave so much to others and returned so little to her. She didn't seek the spotlight, nor did she care for the glittering trappings of wealth. She had inherited her mother's eyes, warm, deep, and filled with an instinctive empathy that made people feel safe in her presence. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who called to check on my cough, and who would sit in the workshop just to watch the wood dust dance in the sunbeams. Her daily life was a masterclass in endurance. I knew she often skipped meals to afford her textbook fees, and she spent her winter nights wrapped in cheap blankets, because the ancient radiator in her apartment building was more of a decorative piece than a source of heat. Yet, whenever I asked how she was doing, she would laugh and tell me about a patient she had helped, or a difficult exam she had passed. She possessed a quiet strength, a resilience that didn't roar but burned steadily like a candle in a dark room. When the winter storm hit, I knew she would be worried, but I had hoped she would stay in the city where it was safe. The roads were treacherous, and the local news was advising everyone to stay indoors. But Maeve was not a person to be deterred by a storm when she felt her family needed her. Maeve's decisions were never governed by utility. When she was 10, she found a wild sparrow with a broken wing in the snow behind the barn. She brought it inside, wrapped it in one of her mother's old wool socks, and stayed up all night dripping water into its tiny beak with an eyedropper. It would have been easier, more practical, to let nature take its course, as Pierce had coldly suggested even then. But Maeve knew that some things are worth saving simply because they are alive and helpless. That was her grain. Gentle, yielding, yet incredibly strong when tested by adversity. It was the same grain that led her to nursing, a profession where she spent her days absorbing the pain of strangers, carrying their burdens on her young shoulders without expecting anything in return. 2 days after my devastating phone call with Pierce, Maeve arrived at my cabin. It was her only day off in 3 weeks, and she had driven through a blinding lake-effect blizzard that had shut down most of the major highways. Her old Ford Focus, a dented, rusted vehicle with a transmission that slipped, and a heater that squealed but barely produced a whisper of warmth, sat idling in my snow-drifted driveway, its tailpipe coughing gray exhaust into the white storm. When she pushed open the heavy front door, her cheeks were bright red from the biting frost, her knitted woolen scarf encrusted with ice. Despite her obvious deep physical exhaustion, the moment she saw me, her face lit up with that warm, fierce smile that had always had the power to banish the darkest, coldest shadows from my mind. She set down a plastic bag of basic groceries on the counter: bread, eggs, a carton of milk, and some cheap soup, and immediately came over to wrap her arms around me. She smelled of the crisp winter air, cheap hospital soap, and lavender. As she pulled back, her trained nurse's eyes instantly registered the subtle, alarming changes in my posture, the slight wheeze in my chest, and the heavy gray fatigue that hung over my eyes like a shroud. She placed her cool hand on my forehead, her brow furrowing with deep concern. "You're not breathing right, Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of immediate, quiet authority that she had learned on the emergency room floor. "And you've lost weight since Thanksgiving. Your face is pale. What's going on? Don't try to hide it from me. I know that cough isn't just from the cold." I tried to brush it off, offering a weak, reassuring smile and making a silly joke about the winter blues and getting older. But Maeve was not easily fooled by my performance. As she moved around the kitchen to put away the groceries, her foot brushed against the small metal wastebasket under the sink. Inside, lying right on top of a pile of aromatic wood shavings, was the crumpled, official-looking document from the hospital. Before I could stop her, she reached down, retrieved the paper, smoothed out the creases on her knee, and read the diagnosis and the stark, highlighted figure of the $3,500 co-payment. I watched her face turn completely pale as she absorbed the words. Her thumb traced the complex medical terminology, her mind instantly translating the sterile, clinical jargon into the terrifying reality of her father's impending mortality. When she looked up at me, her eyes were swimming with warm, unshed tears, but her jaw was set in a hard, stubborn line that reminded me so much of her late mother. "Why didn't you tell me, Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hurt. "This was issued a week ago. You're supposed to be scheduled for surgery next Monday. Why is there no date filled in on the admission sheet?" I sighed, sinking back into my worn wooden chair, unable to look her in the eye. "I didn't want to tell you because I knew you didn't have the money, Maeve. You're barely surviving as it is. Your car needs a new transmission. Your student loans are piling up, and you're working yourself to the bone. I didn't want to add my failing health to your burdens." "Did you call Pierce?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper. I nodded slowly, staring at my calloused hands. He has a lot of his capital tied up in a major business deal right now, Maeve," I said, trying to soften the blow, though I didn't know why I was still protecting the son who had abandoned me to my fate. "He said he couldn't help me right now." Maeve's eyes flashed with a sudden, brilliant, and protective anger. "A lot of capital tied up, Dad. He just posted photos on his social media of his new luxury ski trip in Aspen. He spends more than $3,500 on a single weekend with his country club partners. How could he do this? How could he leave his own father to die over a pocketful of change?" She turned away from me, her shoulders shaking violently as she fought to keep her composure. She walked over to the frost-covered window, staring out into the whiteout conditions of the storm, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. I could see the battle raging inside her, the sheer weight of her helplessness crushing down on her young, tired shoulders. But Maeve Hawthorne was not a person who surrendered to despair. She was a fighter. After a long, agonizing silence, she turned back to face me. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, absolute, and beautiful resolve. "Don't worry about the money, Dad," she said, her voice steady, warm, and clear. "I'll take care of it. You're going to have that surgery next Monday. I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you. Maeve, no, I protested, attempting to stand up, but a sudden violent fit of coughing forced me back into my seat, gasping for air. You don't have that kind of money. I won't let you go into massive debt or do something drastic for me. I've lived a good life. You don't have a choice in this, Dad, she replied, coming over to kneel beside my chair, taking my rough, scarred hands in her own warm palms. You've spent your entire life sacrificing everything for us. When Mom died, you worked 18-hour days in that freezing workshop just to make sure we had food on the table, books for school, and clothes on our backs. You never complained, not once. You wore the same boots for 10 years so we could have what we needed. Now it's my turn to take care of you. Just promise me you'll fight this. Let me handle the rest. I couldn't speak. The lump in my throat was too large, the tears finally spilling over my eyelids and running down my weathered cheeks. She kissed my forehead, her lips warm and dry against my cold, clammy skin. And then she grabbed her keys, wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, and slipped back out into the raging blizzard. I did not know until much later the length and pain of the journey she took that afternoon. Maeve drove her shivering Ford through the treacherous, unplowed streets of Toronto, her visibility reduced to mere feet, her hands freezing on the steering wheel because the car's heater had finally died completely. She drove to a small, dusty pawn shop in the historic district, a place run by an old, cynical man named Mr. Sterling, who had spent his life buying up the desperate remnants of broken lives. Reaching into her collar, she pulled out her most prized possession. It was a delicate, vintage platinum necklace set with a single, flawless emerald, surrounded by tiny, brilliant diamonds. It was the only heirloom our mother had left her, given to Maeve on her 16th birthday, with the instruction to keep it for her own wedding day. It was the physical manifestation of her connection to the mother she had lost too soon. She placed the necklace on the velvet-lined counter. Mr. Sterling inspected it through his loupe, his face expressionless. He knew the value of the piece was easily $10,000 on the open market, but he also knew the desperate look in the young woman's eyes. He offered her exactly $3,500. A cynical, lowball offer designed to exploit her desperation. Maeve didn't haggle. She didn't cry in front of him. She simply nodded, her voice clear as bells when she said, "I'll take it." She walked out of that shop into the freezing wind, her neck bare, her heart hollowed out, but her hand clutched a cashier's check for $3,500. She drove straight to the hospital's billing department, paid the copay in full, and secured my surgery date. When she finally returned to my cabin that night, her fingers were blue from the cold, and she was shivering violently. But when she handed me the official receipt, she smiled through her tears and said, "See, Dad, I told you everything was going to be all right." The surgery was a grueling 4-hour ordeal, but the surgeons were thorough, and my body, hardened by decades of manual labor, fought back with a resilience that surprised even Dr. Henderson. Within a week, the heavy, suffocating weight in my chest was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp pain of healing incisions. Maeve took 2 weeks of unpaid leave from her hospital shifts, sleeping on the narrow cot in my recovery room, feeding me broth and keeping the wood stove stoked with fresh pine. She watched over me like a guardian angel, her presence a constant source of warmth in the cold, sterile recovery ward. Every morning, she would open the blinds to let the winter sun filter in, encouraging me with stories of her hospital shifts, her patients, and her dreams of one day opening a community clinic. Her care was more effective than any painkiller, her love a soothing balm that accelerated my recovery. As I lay in that hospital bed, watching her tirelessly adjust my pillows and monitor my vitals, my mind was filled with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and a deep, burning sense of purpose. I had spent 15 years living a lie, a necessary lie I had believed, designed to shield my children from the corrupting influence of unearned wealth. I wanted them to build their own lives, to find their own strength, and to appreciate the profound dignity of labor. But the experiment was over, and the results were stark. Pierce had been swallowed whole by the very monster I had tried to protect him from, his soul completely hollowed out by greed. Maeve, on the other hand, had emerged from the crucible as a pure, glittering diamond. She had sacrificed her mother's heirloom, her own security, and her comfort just to keep me breathing. The time for hiding had passed. The DSAN I had protected for so long belonged to her, and her alone. By the third week, I was back in my cabin, sitting in my favorite armchair by the stone hearth. The color had returned to my cheeks, and my lungs could once again expand fully, breathing in the comforting scent of wood smoke and cedar. My strength was returning day by day, and the quiet workshop, once a place of silent dread, now felt like a temple of rebirth. I began to prepare for the revelation, gathering the necessary legal documents and coordination with my old attorney, who had kept my secrets safe for over a decade. It was during those quiet days of convalescence that I realized the time had come to reveal the truth. The secret I had carried for over 15 years, a secret that had shaped my humble existence, was finally ready to be brought into the light. One crisp, clear morning, when the winter sun made the snow outside sparkle like a field of diamonds, I asked Maeve to help me walk out to the old wooden barn behind the cabin. The barn served as my workshop, its walls lined with hundreds of specialized hand tools, jars of aged varnishes, and stacks of raw, sweet-smelling timber. Maeve wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders, her eyes filled with gentle concern as she guided my slow, careful steps across the frozen path. "Dad, you shouldn't be working yet," she warned softly as the heavy oak doors of the barn creaked open, releasing a cloud of cold, fragrant air. "Dr. Henderson said no lifting for at least another month. You need to rest." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "I'm not here to work, sweetheart. I'm here to show you something. Something that has been waiting for you for a very long time." I led her past the large central workbench, past the towering stacks of air-dried cherry and oak, to the very back of the barn. In the darkest corner stood a massive old-growth pine cabinet, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked like nothing more than an ancient piece of storage, but I reached behind the molding on the left side, pressing a small, concealed wooden release. With a soft click, the back panel of the cabinet swung open on hidden, handcrafted brass hinges, revealing a narrow stone staircase that descended into the earth. Maeve gasped, her eyes widening as she looked from the dark opening to my face. "Dad, what is this? I've been in this barn 1,000 times. I never knew this was here. Is this some kind of root cellar?" "Hold on to the railing," I said gently, leading the way down the well-lit steps. At the bottom of the stairs, I flicked a switch. A row of soft, warm industrial lights flickered to life, illuminating a clean, dry, climate-controlled basement vault. The space was pristine, entirely free of the dust and cobwebs of the barn above. Arranged along the walls were hundreds of beautifully framed blueprints, technical drawings of breathtakingly complex and elegant furniture, and detailed architectural layouts of some of the most luxurious private estates in North America. In the center of the room sat a massive steel safe. For 40 years I had lived as a simple, reclusive carpenter. But what the world, and my own children, did not know was that in my youth I had been known by a different name. I had been the chief architectural designer and master artisan for the elite. Under a corporate pseudonym, I had designed the bespoke interiors, hand-carved ceilings, and custom furniture for the private residences of some of the wealthiest families in the world. I had registered dozens of highly lucrative design copyrights, patents for innovative joinery techniques, and structural woodwork designs that were still actively used by luxury developers globally. I walked over to the safe, spun the dial, and pulled open the heavy steel door. Inside were stacks of legal documents, patents, copyright certificates, and a single thick black binder containing the statements of a private trust fund. Maeve stood in the center of the vault, her hands covering her mouth as her eyes darted from the masterfully drafted blueprints to the documents in my hands. "Dad, I don't understand. Who did all of this? This looks like a museum of high-end architectural design." "I did, Maeve," I said quietly, handing her the binder. "When your mother passed away 15 years ago, I made a conscious choice. I had seen what extreme wealth did to the people I worked for. I saw how it eroded their families, how it made their children lazy, arrogant, and blind to the true value of human connection. I didn't want that for you and Pierce. I wanted both of you to grow up knowing the value of a hard-earned dollar, to find your own passions, and to build your lives on the foundation of character, not inheritance." So I retired under a pseudonym, locked away my wealth, and lived on a modest pension, pretending to be nothing more than a simple country woodworker. Maeve opened the binder, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers on the trust fund statement. Her breath caught in her throat. The balance of the Hawthorne Creative Trust was just over $12 million, fueled by decades of compounding interest and active global design royalties. This is yours? She whispered, her voice shaking. All of this? Dad, you had $12 million. And you let me sell Mom's necklace? You almost died because you couldn't pay a $3,500 copay? I didn't know about the copay until it was almost too late, Maeve. And when I called Pierce, it wasn't because I couldn't pay it myself. It was because I wanted to see if the wealth he had chased in New York had left any room for his father's life. I wanted to give him one final chance to choose family over his ledger. He failed. He showed me that his soul has been entirely consumed by his greed. I took her hands, my eyes filling with tears as I looked into her beautiful, honest face. But you, my sweet, selfless daughter, you didn't hesitate. You didn't look at a ledger. You sacrificed the only piece of your mother you had left, risking your own health in that freezing storm, just to save my life. You proved that you possessed the true wealth of this family. I handed her a document from the safe, signed and notarized by my attorney just 2 days prior. This is the deed to the Hawthorne Creative Trust, Maeve. I have transferred the entire $12 million, along with all active copyrights and future royalties, into your name. It is yours. You will never have to worry about rent again. You can finish your nursing degree without the shadow of debt, and you can build the clinics and the charities you've always dreamed of. You have earned this, not because you are my blood, but because you are my hero. But Dad, she sobbed, burying her face in my shoulder. What about Pierce? What are you going to do? Pierce made his choice. He decided that I was a liability, a bad investment. Now it's time for him to discover the true cost of his calculations. I have already contacted my old friend Cyrus Vance. It's time for Pierce to face his final audit. The financial district of Manhattan is a world built on the illusion of permanence and power. Its towering glass and steel skyscrapers reach toward the clouds like fingers of black ice, reflecting a gray, indifferent sky. Inside the executive boardroom of Vance Enterprises, on the 74th floor, the atmosphere was charged with the high-stakes tension of a $50 million deal. Pierce Hawthorne sat at the polished mahogany conference table, his posture radiating the supreme, arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had conquered the world. He adjusted his Tom Ford tie, his eyes locked on Cyrus Vance, the legendary 75-year-old real estate billionaire who sat at the head of the table. Cyrus Vance was a giant of the New York skyline, a self-made mogul who had built an empire on luxury hotels and high-end residential towers. But unlike the modern breed of Wall Street raiders, Cyrus was a man of the old school. He valued integrity, loyalty, and the timeless beauty of master craftsmanship. He had spent the last 2 decades collecting rare architectural designs and bespoke woodwork, and his private estate in the Hamptons was widely considered a masterpiece of classic design. Pierce had spent the last 8 months structuring a complex real estate investment trust for Vance Enterprises. If Cyrus signed the documents today, Pierce's hedge fund would secure a massive management fee, and Pierce's personal commission would launch him into the elite tier of Manhattan's financial aristocracy. He had rehearsed his pitch 1,000 times, and he knew exactly which strings to pull to make Cyrus believe this was the safest, most lucrative investment of the year. "The presentations are flawless, Pierce," Cyrus Vance said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that commanded absolute silence in the room. He turned the page of the prospectus, his gold Rolex catching the light. "Your financial modeling is tight, your risk mitigation is thorough. You've built a very compelling case. I can see you've put a lot of work into this." Pierce smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I've always believed that success is a matter of ruthless calculation. In this market, you cannot allow emotion to cloud your judgment. You must view everything through the lens of assets and liabilities. If a component doesn't yield a high return on investment, you cut it loose without hesitation. It's the only way to ensure growth." Cyrus nodded slowly, though his eyes remained fixed on the folder. Ruthless calculation, he murmured. An interesting philosophy. Tell me, Pierce, I was looking over your background check for the SEC compliance filing. I noticed your middle name is Garrick, and you grew up in Ontario. Are you by any chance related to the Hawthorne family of Toronto? Pierce's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A look of mild embarrassment flitted across his handsome face before he quickly masked it with a dismissive wave of his hand. The financial collapse of Pierce's hedge fund was not just a failure of capital. It was a failure of his core philosophy. He had built his entire career on the belief that relationships were leverage, that trust was a commodity to be traded, and that loyalty was a luxury for those who couldn't afford to win. He had forgotten that Wall Street, for all its glittering facade, is a nest of vipers that will turn on you the moment they smell blood in the water. When Cyrus Vance withdrew his capital, it wasn't just a loss of $30 million. It was a signal to the rest of the street that Pierce Hawthorne was toxic, a liability to be avoided at all costs. The very partners who had laughed at his jokes and copied his trades were the first to shut their doors in his face, deleting his number from their phones before the ink on the liquidation papers was dry. Technically, yes, Pierce replied, his tone dripping with condescension. My father, Garrick Hawthorne, still lives up there. He's a retired small-town carpenter. He spent his life working in a dusty shop, carving wooden chairs and tables. He's a very simple man, Mr. Vance, entirely obsolete in his thinking, I'm afraid. He lives in a tiny cabin, lives hand-to-mouth, and has no concept of modern finance. In fact, he called me recently asking for a financial bailout for some medical issue. Of course, I had to refuse. In my line of work, you cannot reward poor planning. It's a bad allocation of capital. I can't let sentimentality interfere with my professional integrity. Cyrus Vance froze. He slowly closed the prospectus folder, the sharp slap of paper echoing in the silent boardroom like a gunshot. He raised his head, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Pierce, with an intensity that made the young hedge fund manager's breath catch in his throat. Your father is Garrick Hawthorne? Cyrus asked, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. Yes, Mr. Vance, Pierce said, feeling a sudden inexplicable chill in the room but trying to maintain his confident posture. But as I said, we don't have much of a relationship. He's a financial liability, and I've had to cut him loose to focus on my fiduciary duties to clients like you. Cyrus did not answer. Instead, he reached into his vest pocket, pulled out his personal cell phone, and dialed a number. He pressed the speakerphone button, placing the device in the center of the mahogany table. The line rang twice before a deep, calm, familiar voice answered. Cyrus, my old friend, the voice said, sounding strong, clear, and vibrant. To what do I owe the pleasure of a call during market hours? Pierce's face drained of color. He recognized that voice instantly. It was his father. But the tone was different. It wasn't the weak, rattling voice of a dying man. It was the voice of an equal, a man who spoke to a billionaire with the easy confidence of a lifelong friend. Garrick, my old friend, Cyrus said, his gravelly voice suddenly filled with deep warmth and respect. I'm sitting in my boardroom, preparing to sign a $50 million deal, but I'm looking at a young man named Pierce Hawthorne, who claims to be your son. He's currently explaining to me how he recently refused to lend you $3,500 for a life-saving cancer surgery, 'cause you are a financial liability. I wanted to hear the truth from you, old friend. There was a brief silence on the line. When my father spoke again, his voice was laced with a thrumming, resonant sorrow. It is true, Cyrus, my father said quietly. I called Pierce 3 weeks ago. I told him about the tumor. I asked to borrow the co-payment to secure my surgery date. He told me that from a financial perspective, investing in my life was a bad allocation of capital. He told me he was putting together a $50 million deal with you, and that his liquidity was locked up. He hung up and blocked my number. Cyrus Vance's jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cords. He stared at Pierce, who was now trembling violently, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table as if to keep the room from spinning. And how did you pay the copay, Garrick? Cyrus asked, his eyes never leaving Pierce's terrified face. My daughter, Maeve, my father replied, his voice thick with emotion. She's a student nurse. She drove through a blizzard, sold her late mother's emerald wedding necklace to a predatory pawn shop for $3,500, and paid the hospital herself. She saved my life, Cyrus. Pierce left me to die in the snow. Thank you, Garrick, Cyrus said softly, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. I'm glad to hear you are recovering. I will call you tonight for our weekly chess game. Give Maeve my regards. Tell her that her mother's necklace will be back in her possession before sunset. The call disconnected. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy with the weight of an impending execution. Pierce stood up, his voice cracking as he tried to speak, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his gold fountain pen onto the table. Mr. Vance, please, you don't understand, Pierce stammered, his face pale as ashes. It was a business decision. I had to protect my fund's liquidity for this deal. I was doing it for the success of our partnership. I didn't want any distractions. Protect your liquidity, Cyrus Vance whispered, standing up slowly. His massive frame towered over the table like a mountain of granite. Do you have any idea who your father is, you arrogant, ignorant fool? Pierce stared at him, blankly, his mind racing. He's just a retired carpenter from Ontario. He is Garrick Hawthorne, Cyrus roared, slamming his fist onto the table with a force that made the glasses rattle. He is the master architect who designed the hand-carved cherry interiors of my Hamptons estate. He is the genius who holds the design patents for half of the luxury developments on the East Coast. For 40 years, the wealthiest men in this country have begged for his blueprints. He is a legend, and his design trust is worth millions. I have spent 30 years trying to convince him to partner with me on a national development project, and he refused because he preferred the peace of his workshop. Cyrus leaned across the table, his face inches from Pierce's. And you, his own son, left a legendary artisan, a man of pure genius and integrity, to die of cancer over a measly $3,500? You stood in my boardroom and called your own father a bad investment. You let your sister sell your mother's legacy while you drove a Porsche. Mr. Vance, I didn't know. Pierce gasped, tears of panic finally spilling over his eyes. If I had known about his wealth, I would have given him everything. I would have paid for the entire surgery myself. If you had known, you would have acted like a decent human being. Cyrus sneered, his voice dripping with disgust. That makes you a coward as well as a monster, Pierce. A man who only shows mercy when there's a return on investment is not a man. He's a parasite, and I do not do business with parasites. Cyrus turned to his chief legal counsel, who sat at the end of the table. Cancel the REIT. Pull all Vance Enterprises capital out of Pierce's hedge fund immediately. Send a formal notice to the SEC and the Board of Governors of the Financial Association detailing his ethical bankruptcy. I want him stripped of his license by the end of the day. He is finished on Wall Street. Mr. Vance, please, you'll ruin me, Pierce sobbed, falling to his knees on the carpet. My fund, my reputation, everything I've built, I'll have nothing left. You didn't build anything, Pierce, Cyrus said coldly, walking toward the door without looking back. You calculated, and today your calculations have finally caught up with you. Get this garbage out of my office. The descent from the heights of Manhattan's financial elite to the absolute bottom of the social ladder is a swift, brutal journey. When a billionaire of Cyrus Vance's stature decides to destroy a man, the destruction is total and absolute. Within 48 hours of that fateful boardroom meeting, Vance Enterprises had pulled over $30 million of institutional capital from Pierce's hedge fund. The sudden mass redemption triggered a cascade of panic among the other investors, who rushed to withdraw their funds before the entire firm collapsed. Within a week, the fund was forced into involuntary liquidation, and the SEC launched a full investigation into Pierce's financial dealings. Pierce's arsenals were seized to cover the massive liabilities of his failing firm. His pristine Porsche was repossessed in front of his office building. His luxury Manhattan penthouse was put up for foreclosure, and his name was blacklisted across every financial institution from New York to London. The high society friends who had toasted his success and drank his expensive champagne vanished like smoke in the wind, leaving him completely, utterly alone in a cold, indifferent city. He was evicted from his home, his bank accounts frozen, and his reputation completely destroyed. He was a pariah, a man whose name was synonymous with betrayal and greed. The blizzard that hit Ontario 3 weeks later was the worst of the season, a freezing gale that buried the roads under 4 feet of ice and snow. Inside my cabin, the stone hearth was ablaze, with a roaring fire of aged birchwood, filling the room with a deep, comforting warmth and the sweet, resinous scent of burning sap. Maeve sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, as she reviewed the final blueprints for the Maeve Hawthorne Foundation, a nonprofit organization we had established using the trust fund's capital to build free community health clinics and provide financial assistance for cancer patients across the province. On her neck, catching the warm light of the fire, was her mother's emerald necklace, which Cyrus Vance had quietly purchased back from the pawnshop and returned to her as a gift of respect. We had spent the afternoon talking about the future, about the lives we would touch and the healing we would bring to families who, unlike ours, had been broken by the cruel machinery of financial hardship. Maeve was happy, her laughter a sweet, musical sound that filled the cabin with a joy that had been missing since my wife passed away. We were a family again, bound not by the cold calculations of wealth, but by the warm, enduring ties of sacrifice and love. A sudden, heavy, desperate pounding on the thick oak front door broke the quiet peace of the evening. Maeve looked up, her eyes filled with immediate concern. The wind outside was screaming, a wild beast clawing at the logs of the cabin. "Who could be out in this storm?" she murmured, standing up to walk toward the window to peer outside. "The roads are completely closed. It's a whiteout." I held up my hand, stopping her with a gentle but firm gesture. "Stay here, sweetheart," I said quietly. "I'll get it. I know who it is." I walked over to the door, pulled back the heavy iron bolt that I had handcrafted decades ago, and swung it open. The freezing wind rushed into the warm cabin, bringing with it a flurry of white, icy snow that melted instantly on the warm floorboards. Standing on the porch, shivering violently and clutching his arms, was Pierce. As I sat by the warm fireplace that winter evening, listening to the logs hiss and pop, I looked at Maeve and felt a profound sense of completion. My wife's emerald necklace rested against her skin, its deep green stone reflecting the golden light of the flames. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of an unbroken chain of love and sacrifice that had survived the storm. Pierce had believed that by hoarding his wealth, he was protecting his future. But in the end, he was left with nothing but cold, empty numbers. Maeve had given away everything she had, risking her own future for mine, and in doing so, she had inherited the world. That was the true law of the hearth. The only wealth that endures is the wealth you are willing to give away for the sake of those you love. He was unrecognizable. The bespoke Tom Ford suit was gone, replaced by a cheap, thin winter coat that was soaked through with freezing rain. He wore no gloves, his fingers were blue and stiff, and his expensive leather shoes were ruined, caked in frozen mud and slush. He had been forced to take a public bus from New York to Toronto, and he had walked the final 3 miles from the highway through the blinding storm because he could no longer afford a taxi. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a desperate animal-like terror. "Dad," he sobbed, his voice cracking as he fell to his knees on the snow-covered porch, his knees sinking into the drift. "Please, Dad, you have to help me. I've lost everything. The fund is gone. My apartment is gone. I'm completely bankrupt. I have nowhere else to go. I'm freezing." I stood in the doorway, my thick wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders, feeling the cold air rush past me. I looked down at my eldest son, the boy I had loved, the man who had left me to die over a measly $3,500. I felt no anger, no hatred, and no desire for petty vengeance. I only felt a deep, profound, and heavy sorrow for the hollow, empty shell of a man he had become. "Why are you here, Pierce?" I asked, my voice calm, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I'm your son, Dad," he cried, reaching out with his blue, shaking hands to grab the hem of my trousers, his frozen fingers trembling against the fabric. "We're blood. You can't just leave me out here. You have millions. Cyrus told me everything. You have the trust fund, the copyrights. Please, just lend me enough to hire a lawyer, to get back on my feet. I'll pay you back with interest, I swear. I'm a good investment, Dad. I know how to navigate the market. I can manage your portfolio." I looked past him, out into the vast, white, howling darkness of the storm. The snow was falling so fast it seemed to erase the very landscape, swallowing the pines and the path in a shroud of white. "You still don't understand, Pierce," I said softly, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "You look at me now, and you still only see a transaction. You see a ledger. You see a return on investment. You think that because we share blood, I am obligated to balance your accounts. Dad, please. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was under so much pressure." He wept, his head bowing into the snow on the porch, his tears freezing on his cheeks. "I didn't mean what I said. I was just stressed about the deal. Please, let me inside. I'm freezing to death." I took a deep breath, the cold, clean air filling my healthy, healed lungs. "When I called you 3 weeks ago, Pierce, I wasn't asking for your money. I was asking for your heart. I was giving you the chance to prove that you valued your father's life more than your financial standing. But you looked at your own father, the man who raised you, and you calculated that my survival was a bad liability. You cut me loose because I didn't fit into your balance sheet. You chose the Porsche, the suits, and the luxury over your own blood." I stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, slowly pulling the heavy oak door shut. "You told me that throwing money into a dying man was a bad allocation of capital, Pierce. Well, my daughter Maeve taught me what a true investment is. She invested her love, her sacrifice, and her mother's memory to save my life, and she is the only heir to my Dyson. I have no more assets for you, Pierce. I am just a simple, retired carpenter. And as you said, I cannot keep liabilities on my balance sheet. I hope the cold teaches you what the warmth of this family could not." "No, Dad, please. Don't do this," Pierce screamed, his hands pounding weakly against the heavy wood as the iron bolts slid back into place, locking him out in the cold. The heavy metallic thud of the lock echoed through the cabin, sealing the warmth inside and the cold outside. I walked back to the stone hearth, sitting down in my favorite armchair beside Maeve. She reached over, taking my hand in hers, her warm fingers squeezing mine with a reassuring strength that banished the chill of the storm. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a lonely, desolate sound, carrying away the desperate, fading cries of a son who had calculated the price of everything, but had never understood the value of anything. We sat in the warm glow of the fire, the silence between us rich with the quiet peace of justice served, and the enduring warmth of a family built on love, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of the golden wood. Pierce would survive the night. There was a small emergency shelter in the barn with blankets and heat if he had the humility to look for it. But he would never again find a place in the warmth of my hearth. The ledger was closed, the accounts were balanced, and the truth had finally been carved in stone. In the end, the traps we build for others usually end up catching our own heels. If you enjoyed seeing justice find its way home today, please hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.